Hello again. So now we're back on chapter 18. So chapter 18 focuses specifically on the French Revolution. So the French Revolution lasted between 1789 and 1799. There's a little bit of dispute on that as to how it ended up starting and how it ended up ending. There's different variations on it, but it was around that time frame, so within that decade of time. The struggle was constitutional and it was peaceful at first. So at first they thought that they were going to be able to break through it, figure it out between the different classes. But then later on, it's going to have more of a militaristic endeavor when they talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. Some historians believe that the revolution basically ended prior to Bonaparte. And then there's other historians that think that Bonaparte's takeover was also a part of the French Revolution. And that's what this book kind of condescends as well. So why did the French Revolution start? That's kind of important. So the primary reason was class conflict. So this was kind of leading up. We already knew that this was going to happen. If you remember correctly, the French common people were already being overtaxed by their leader. You remember? And then in terms of the upper class weren't being taxed at all. They were exempt from taxation. So this is what's going to call your classic class conflict at this point in time. So the bourgeoisie, they felt empowered. So the bourgeoisie, they basically felt empowered at this point in time. It was basically due to the Enlightenment. They basically thought that this was the time when they can actually break free and stand against, the monarchy, stand against the upper class. Okay, so the division is going to be between them and the aristocrats. They want to stand against them at this point in time. And they also had heavy conflicts with Louis the 16th, who was the ruler at this point in time. Because of Louis kind of lived an extravagant lifestyle. So as we know, because he's in Versailles, he's living the lap of luxury. So debts and expenses tended to increase because of him and his wife. So because of that, he summoned the Estates General in 1789. The Estates General is basically very similar to a parliament. However, they have more of a financial role within France. So he basically summoned them because he needed to figure out how he was going to get money, basically. So what ended up happening was that he met with them, and of course that's going to trigger more taxation, unfortunately. So that's going to lead to revolts, specifically with the common people. The book also defines them as sans-culottes. So if you type the French word, sans-culottes means men without the long pants. That's basically what it stands for. So if you look at a noble person is going to be wearing different type of trousers than that of a common man. So that's basically what the word actually means when you translate it from French into English. So that's basically how they defined themselves, how to, know the difference between a person who is of noble status and a person who is a commoner. So of course going to revolt against the aristocracy, and they're also going to revolt against the monarchy as well. In August of 1789, we have the thing known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So basically what this was, it kind of was almost like a buffer, I would say, to kind of appease the commoners, to kind of give them a little bit more rights, a little bit more of a voice than what they had before. So the Declaration of Rights of the Man and the Citizen basically guaranteed rights under a law, specifically for adult males. It also provided religious toleration, so regardless of what religion they ended up practicing. It also abolished serfdom and banned slavery in France. So the main key is that it banned slavery in France, but it did not ban slavery in the New World. So if France had slaves in the New World, say in the southern parts of North America, or if they had them in Canada when they were residing there, same thing, that was allowed, but not within the borders of France on the mainland in Europe. Okay. Louis at this point in time also became the weakened leader. He was actually imprisoned because of all the different things that he ended up doing, specifically in terms of taxation and the fact that he was losing favor with his people. Specifically. So while he was in prison, the National Convention took over and they became the next governing body of France at this point in time. Okay, so this is what's going to lead up to the Reign of Terror that the textbook calls it. So from September 1793 to July 1794, we have these figures that came about within France that kind of caused a lot of strife within the people. So this the Reign of Terror was led by individuals named as Marat, Danton, and Robespierre. Robespierre is probably the most important, I think, out of the three. They created what's known as the Committee of Public Safety. With that Committee of Public Safety, they brought about dictatorship, centralization, and also suspension of liberties, and also the ability to combat war, start a war if they needed to. So basically that contradicted that Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen that was founded before. So once again, the common people are going to be kind of upset about what happened with this reign of terror. When you think about the reign of terror too, think about the heavy use of the guillotine. The book does talk about the guillotine, why it was founded, quick way to, I guess you can say kill people if you wanted to do that at this point in time in France too. So between those periods, so between 1793 and 1794, there was deaths of close to 40,000 people that are basically considered, against the policies, against politics. So because of that, since they're considered in those types of roles, they would end up being killed by the guillotine. It also led to the incarceration of between 300,000 and 400,000 people who stood against, the reign of terror as well. Okay. Eventually, that kind of came subdued, and that was basically due to the fact that on July 27th, 1794, Robespierre was guillotined, along with about 21 of his fellow associates as well. So that basically put an end to the reign of terror. However, it led to an individual named by Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon Bonaparte was a young general. In November of 1799, he was declared temporary consul. So when I think of the term consul, I think of, ancient Rome. When we talk about ancient Rome, Rome didn't want a monarchy. They feared that a monarch would then become a dictator. So they basically instituted what was called a council. So a council, or consul, is basically a person who would be put into power to basically work along with Parliament, or in this case, the Estates General or the French Parliament, to kind of provided not only checks and balances, but it also prevented them from having an absolute monarchy as well. So in terms of Bonaparte was elected just a temporary consul. Okay. He did a couple of good things in the beginning. So he established universal white male suffrage, which basically meant that any male, regardless of whether they are a peasant or whether they are of high noble standing, they actually have the right to vote, which was something that was unheard of at this point in time. He also instituted 2 legislative bodies within France, which is going to help with the whole checks and balances system on him. So he'd have to go to those 2 bodies to kind of get his laws and those types of things enacted. In 1802, he became consul for life. Not a dictator at this point in time, but just consul for life. He developed several legal codes. He rationalized the education system. He also built a military academy, which is going to help to create his standing army that he's going to need as well. Between 1806 and 1815, people within Europe, other countries, other nations are going to start to fear Bonaparte. At this point in time, they thought that he was becoming too powerful, and specifically the nations around them wanted to kind of put him at bay. They kind of felt the fear that he was becoming too much of a dictator, and that he was going to expand even outward outside of France. Okay, so because of that, wars ended up starting, conflicts started between different nations against France. Bonaparte at this point in time ended up being exiled. He was exiled to the island of Elba. However, he did return to France about a year later. He ended up trying to fight in a battle at Waterloo. Ended up getting lost, unfortunately, defeated. And he was actually shipped to the island of St. Helena, and he actually died in 1821. And word has it was that he was actually poisoned to death, which is probably the easiest way, because they felt that if he was going to be exiled, he's going to find a way to come back again. If he came back from Elba, he's going to come back from the island of St. Helena. But that wasn't the case. He was actually poisoned to death, and that's the way to go. Other things that the textbook also talks about within that chapter is, of course, the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was led by Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint was actually one of the most successful individuals and generals to actually lead a successful slave revolt in Haiti. The only one. And if you ever look back on slave revolutions, we talk about them back at the time of, the Greeks. We talk about them at the time of the Persians, and that didn't happen at that point in time. So this was one of the first that was successful, and they were able to bring Haiti as its own country, thanks to that whole entire revolution that ended up being founded. Okay, thank you.